Everyone thought he was mad, but his return to the village sparked a revolution in global trade. A long black Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled into the private hangar at Murtala Mohammed International Airport. The tires kissed the concrete as a man in a tailored three-piece agbada stepped out. Cameras flashed. His name, Tundo Kizi, was trending in 5 countries. But no one really knew how he got here. As he walked towards the private jet, a journalist shouted, Sir, how did you build the biggest agro-export business in Africa without investors?" Tund turned his head slightly. His dark shades reflected the jet's silver skin. He didn't answer. Instead, his fingers touched a small wooden keychain tied to his briefcase. It was shaped like a palm tree. A memory. A symbol. He boarded the jet. The engines whirled to life. Everyone clapped. But only Tund could hear the whispers from the past. London, 12 years earlier. Tund sat in the 34th floor corner office of Ashcroft and Glen, one of the UK's most prestigious law firms. The view from Canary Wharf looked like something out of a dream. Glass towers, moving lights, and suits that cost more than small cars. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. The resignation letter was finished, but he hadn't sent it. His colleague, Rachel, leaned over the glass partition. "Tund, are you really quitting?" "For what?" "Farming." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Palm oil," he replied. Rachel blinked. "Palm oil." He nodded. "Back in my village, we used to call it red gold. But nobody knew what to do with it. I think I do now. You're on the partner track. You drive a Maserati. You live in Mayfair." Tund stood up slowly. Exactly. That night, he turned in his access card. Walked away from 7 figures. Bought a one-way ticket to Owerri, Nigeria. At Heathrow, the immigration officer squinted at his form. "You're relocating?" "Yes." "To do what?" He smiled again. "Change the world." Back in Imo State, the air was thicker. The roads were red, dusty. The old palm mill was covered in weeds. The smell of rotting nuts filled the air. An old man watched him from the bush and muttered, "Oh boy, Don Craze. London lawyer come day pursue palm oil. Nah jazz." The others laughed. But Tund didn't hear them. He was staring at the old pressing machine. "You will live again," he whispered. That night, he slept on a bamboo mat. His imported mattress was still in the container, stuck in Lagos. Mosquitoes bit his arms. He stared at the rusted ceiling fan and smiled like he knew something no one else did. He wasn't here to just sell oil. He was here to start a revolution. London wasn't just a city, it was a performance. And for years, Tund played the part perfectly. His penthouse in Mayfair overlooked Hyde Park. Every morning, the sun crept across his marble countertops and bounced off the glass walls. His closets were filled with Tom Ford suits, and the valet downstairs knew to always keep his Maserati washed and waxed. At 31, Tund was already a senior associate at Ashcroft and Glen. He had just closed a $300 million merger between 2 oil giants and was the rising star of the African legal desk. His friends envied him. His parents bragged about him back in Nigeria. His name often came up in the diaspora dinner circles, where success stories were currency. But Tund was restless. One night, during a wine-tasting event in Notting Hill, a friend raised a glass and said, "To Tund, who left the jungle and conquered the courtroom." Everyone laughed, but Tund's smile froze. Jungle? Later that night, he went home, loosened his tie, and stood by the glass window of his 25th floor apartment. Down below, black cabs zipped through the cold rain. Above, the skyline blinked with ambition. But in his head, he kept hearing his grandmother's voice. "You will forget who you are if you chase only what they build." She had died when he was 15. But lately, her voice had returned, whispering through his dreams. Always in the same setting, a palm oil mill with red rivers and fire pits. He would wake up sweating, the scent of roasted palm nuts clinging to his nose like a ghost. It was silly. He was a city man now, a barrister. He had appeared before British judges and dined with corporate billionaires. What was all this nonsense about dreams? Still, it persisted. One day, during a board meeting with French clients, someone passed him a file. Tund opened it and stared blankly. Instead of text, he saw a child carrying a basket of palm kernels. The scent hit him again. "Mr. Okizi?" the client asked, confused. "Is something wrong?" He blinked. "No. Sorry. Just a little tired." But it wasn't fatigue. It was something deeper. He called in sick that week. Walked aimlessly through Soho, then into Brixton, where the African shops reminded him of home. He bought a bottle of crude palm oil from a Ghanaian auntie who smiled warmly and said, "This reminds you of someone, eh?" He nodded, though he wasn't sure why. Back home, he placed the bottle on his kitchen counter. Its thick red color glowed beneath the city lights. The next morning, he emailed his managing partner. Subject: resignation. His boss called within minutes. "You're joking. You want to go where?" "Nigeria. To practice law there?" "No," Tun said softly. "To start something." "What will you even sell?" "Software? Crypto." Tun looked at the oil bottle. "Palm oil." The call went quiet. That evening, he hosted a final dinner for close friends. They wore tuxedos and cocktail dresses, toasted champagne under gold lights. "This is a phase," one said. "You'll come back." But Tund only smiled. Because he already knew. He wasn't going back to Nigeria to escape London. He was going back to build something London could never understand. The wheels of the airport taxi hit the uneven road with a loud thud. A cloud of red dust rose behind the vehicle as it struggled up a bumpy hill, past crumbling colonial buildings and long-forgotten kiosks with peeling Coca-Cola signs. Chickens darted across the road. Young boys carried jerrycans of water on their heads. And above it all, the hot Nigerian sun hung like a heavy punishment. Tund adjusted his sunglasses and peered through the cracked window. This was Umanik, his village, a place he hadn't returned to in over 10 years. The driver glanced at him. "Oga, not here you day stay?" Tun nodded slowly. "Yes, drop me here." The compound was smaller than he remembered. Paint chipped off the walls like memories that didn't want to stay. Weeds had swallowed the front yard. But the scent was the same, the thick smell of palm kernels, firewood, and sunburned earth. His uncle, Chief Nonso, emerged shirtless from a nearby shed, frowning. "You? London lawyer? You came back for what?" Tun dropped his suitcase and hugged him. "I came to build something, uncle." The chief chuckled bitterly. "So you left your fine office in London to come and turn red oil? Tund, are you well?" That week, word spread through the village like harmattan fire. Tundo Kizi, the one who wore white wigs in London courtrooms, is back. He says he wants to press palm oil. Maybe his juju man died. Even his own cousin, Ibuka, laughed when Tund asked about the abandoned palm oil press down the hill. "That thing? It hasn't worked in 20 years, Ibuka said, spitting on the floor. "Even my father gave up on it. The engines are gone. The belt is rusted. You better go back to London before the snakes come for your fine skin." But Tund didn't flinch. The next day, he walked alone to the mill. The metal roof had collapsed in one corner. Termites had eaten half the wooden frames. The air was thick with decay, but something inside Tund stirred, an odd feeling of hope. He bent and picked up a broken gear. "You will live again," he whispered, just like he did the first time. Using his savings from London, he hired local welders, plumbers, and engineers from Owerri. He imported parts from Germany. The villagers watched in silence at first, then in mockery. See as Oyobo lawyer day turned mechanic. Tomorrow now he go cry come beg for ticket back. But Tund kept working. He bought new pressing drums. He replaced the fire pits with safer, steel-lined kilns. He installed solar panels to run the belt engines. He even brought in a filtration system, an idea he got from watching how olive oil was processed in Italy. People started noticing. Some kids peeked through the zinc fence to watch him work. An old woman brought him roasted plantain one afternoon and said, "My late husband used to work here. May God bless your hands, son." But others still doubted him. "Palm oil doesn't need all this," a trader scoffed at the local market. "Just boil the thing and press it. Why waste so much?" Tun smiled. "Because I'm not selling to people who think like you." He created a company on paper, Redroots Global. He registered it officially, designed a logo himself, and used the last of his funds to print gold-labeled bottles for export testing. By the third month, the machines roared to life. Oil flowed thick and clean from the pipes. He stood in front of it all, covered in grease and sweat, grinning like a madman. But there was one problem. No one wanted to buy it. Tun sat on an old plastic chair outside the freshly cleaned factory, watching the final batch of palm oil swirl into a stainless steel holding tank. The machines were working. The bottles were printed. The oil was rich, thick, and smelled exactly how it should. But buyers? Nowhere. He had sent samples to 5 regional retailers in Owerri and ABA. No replies. At Ariaria Market, Traders waved off his neatly bottled palm oil with a smirk. This one not foreign style. Who get time for label when people just day look for price? Worse, the local women who sold unfiltered oil in yellow gallons mocked him openly. Oga lawyer, you go soon start to fry akara with this your golden bottle. Tun didn't respond. He listened, and he watched. Then he returned to his small room in his uncle's compound, opened his laptop, and began to write. Palm oil in the village was a matter of taste and habit. People were used to buying cloudy, unfiltered gallons, sometimes mixed with water or old oil. They didn't care about packaging. They didn't even trust packaging. But Tund wasn't building this for the village. He was building for the world. He stayed up that night, analyzing charts, researching competitors, and breaking down the export data for palm oil out of Indonesia and Malaysia. That's when it hit him. Africa had the resources, but not the standards. The issue wasn't production, it was process. The West didn't just want palm oil, they wanted refined, hygienic, traceable palm oil with certified documentation. He needed to stop thinking like a villager and start building like a corporation. The next day, he turned the oil mill into a company. Literally, he created proper roles: operations manager, quality control officer, safety inspector. He hired young, jobless graduates from Owerri and gave them real titles. He printed ID cards, drew up SOPs, and made everyone sign NDAs. People laughed harder now. "You day give factory workers job contract?" his cousin Ibuka said, barely containing his laughter. "Tund, you day craze pass your papa." But Tund pressed on. He built a small office next to the mill using old shipping containers. He wired it with internet from a local provider, put up glass windows, and installed air conditioning. Inside, he placed whiteboards covered in flowcharts, maps, and diagrams. It was half factory, half startup hub. He trained the workers to clean their boots before entering production. Hairnets were mandatory. Every bottle had a printed batch number, expiration date, and QR code. People in the village began calling it the oil hospital. And when the oil still didn't sell, Tun changed his approach. He printed flyers and drove to Lagos. At networking events in Victoria Island, he wore suits and shook hands. He carried samples of his bottled palm oil in a leather briefcase, the way some people carry fine wine. At first, people thought he was crazy. Palm oil? In a bottle? For export? But then, someone listened. A businesswoman in Lekki who owned a gourmet store took a sample. She tasted it. Her eyes widened. "This is clean. Very clean. Not like the ones we usually get." She placed a small order. Just 50 bottles. Tun drove back to Imo himself and supervised the packaging. He printed a delivery receipt, sealed the crate, and made the journey back to Lagos personally. The store sold out in 3 days. A week later, a French customer emailed her, asking where she sourced the palm oil. She forwarded the email to Tund. This was the beginning of something. In the village, people still mocked him. But he had started dressing differently, not in agbatas or suits, but factory overalls and safety boots. The students he hired now walked with pride. Parents began dropping off CVs. But behind the excitement, a new fear grew. He had used up nearly all of his life savings. The first batch had sold, but that wasn't enough. He needed capital. He needed logistics. He needed a miracle. And he would soon get one, but only if he could meet a nearly impossible demand. 10 tons of palm oil in 30 days. And no one in Ummanik thought he could pull it off. Tun stood outside the small office container he had converted into his headquarters, holding his phone so tightly it nearly cracked in his hand. 10 tons, he repeated, voice low. Yes, the woman on the other end said in a clipped French accent. That is the minimum order for our initial trial shipment. You deliver that, we talk contract. Her name was Madame Lacroix. She represented a French organic grocery chain with over 120 stores across Europe. They had found his product through the Lekki Gourmet store and wanted to try a new line of African premium oils. It was the break he'd been praying for. But 10 tons in 30 days? That was more than he had ever processed, even with his upgraded systems. He walked back into the mill and looked around. His machines were working, yes, but barely. The staff was small. Some of them still didn't fully understand hygiene protocols. They were loyal but inexperienced. And then there was the supply issue. He didn't have enough palm kernels to press that much oil. As if summoned by fate, Ibuka appeared by the door with his usual grin. I hear say Oyabo woman Don give you big order. 10 tons. Oh boy, "Nah, movie we go watch." Tund ignored him. Instead, he drove to the neighboring villages, talking to smallholder farmers who had abandoned their palms due to low prices. He offered them double the market rate for their kernels if they could supply immediately. At first, they were skeptical, but when he pulled out cash and contracts, eyes widened. By the third day, trucks began arriving at the mill gate. Some people came with wheelbarrows, others with bags tied to motorcycles. Tund's workers formed a queue system, weighing, logging, testing. Every transaction recorded. It wasn't perfect. Some tried to sneak in bad kernels, but Tund was quick to discipline. He brought in a childhood friend from Lagos, Lanra, who had experience with logistics. Lanra laughed when he arrived. "You've turned this place into a war zone, my guy." Tund smiled. A war zone with French money waiting on the other side. They mapped out a 24-hour schedule. Shifts were introduced. Night teams wore reflective jackets. Generators roared all night. Meals were arranged for workers, and temporary sleeping tents were built in the back for those staying overnight. But the pressure was massive. On the 18th day, a fire broke out near the roasting pit. No one was hurt, but they lost a full batch. Tund didn't sleep that night. He simply sat on a bench, face in his hands, breathing slowly. He called Madame Lacroix the next day. "There's been a slight setback." She responded coolly. "We expect professionalism." The words stung, but they were fair. Tund doubled down. He called in favors. A young engineer he had mentored in London helped him remotely optimize output. They introduced a filtration shortcut that saved hours. Lanra found a trucking company willing to haul goods from Imo to Lagos under a payment-on-delivery deal. Risky, but necessary. By day 27, they had 9.2 tons. Still short. Then something happened. Some of the same villagers who mocked him weeks ago came forward with fresh supplies. "Use this one, Okizi. We see what you day do. Make Africa proud." That night, under the light of halogen lamps, the final barrels were sealed. The truck was loaded and ready to leave for Lagos. And just as the sun rose on day 30, Tund signed the final export manifest. The oil was on its way, but his trials were far from over. At Apapa port, things took a dark turn. The container was seized by customs. No reason, no explanation, just a cold whisper from the officer in charge. "You go settle us, or your oil go expire here." Tund stared at him, heart pounding. That oil was everything. His investment, his credibility, his future. But if he gave a bribe, he'd betray everything he stood for. He looked at the man and said, "I won't pay." The officer smiled, folded his arms, and walked away. Tund was frozen. Had he just destroyed his dream at the edge of success? He sat on the steps of the port office, watching trucks pass. Hours passed. Then a voice spoke behind him. "You're the guy refusing to pay bribes, right?" Tund turned. A customs officer, younger, clean-cut, and unfamiliar. He introduced himself as Inspector David. Quietly, he handed Tund a file. "I processed your documents last week. Everything's in order. I'll sign off the release. Just don't stop doing it the right way. People like you give the rest of us hope." Tund stared at him in disbelief. The officer smiled, signed the document, and walked away without asking for anything. The container rolled out of the port that evening. And on the 33rd day, he received a message from Madame Lacroix. "Shipment received. Quality confirmed. Let's talk contract." Tund didn't reply immediately. He was too busy dancing in the middle of his dusty village road. The same road where people once called him mad. But now they called him boss. And yet, this was only the beginning. Tund moved into a small service department in Lekki Phase 1. It wasn't the penthouse in Mayfair, but it had steady electricity, fast internet, and just enough space for his growing ambitions. From his balcony, he could see a skyline that reminded him of two versions of Nigeria, one climbing toward the future and the other still stuck in yesterday. The container had barely landed in France when emails started flooding in. Boutique stores in Marseille wanted samples. A chef in Lyon posted a video drizzling Redroot's palm oil over grilled snapper, calling it the truffle of West Africa. Influencers began tagging the product, marveling at the gold-trimmed bottle and its deep, rich color. Even a small health food store in Sweden inquired about wholesale orders. Tund's phone was now buzzing constantly. But Lagos, with all its glamour and promise, quickly reminded him that this journey wasn't going to be smooth. His first business networking event was at a rooftop lounge in Victoria Island. The dress code was strictly formal, the air scented with cologne and old money. Men and women talked about venture capital, fintech apps, and digital banking. When he mentioned he sold palm oil, someone chuckled. That's cute. Like an eco startup? No, Tund replied. I export real palm oil. For food. For wellness. For beauty. Not as a brand story. As a real product. The smiles froze. Some excused themselves. Others nodded politely and changed the subject. It wasn't just the elite's arrogance. The real problems came with scale. The trucking company that had helped him deliver the last container suddenly backed out. We need 100% upfront this time. Your type day always run us street, the manager said. Then one of his local suppliers tried to inflate prices mid-delivery. His bank delayed a major payment because the manager didn't understand how palm oil could be worth that much in Europe. Not local product now, he shrugged. Worse still, a logistics company in Yaba charged him twice for the same shipping invoice. When he confronted them, they told him to go and sue. Tun sat in his small apartment one evening, head in his hands. He wasn't broke yet, but cash flow was thin. His second batch of export oil was ready, but he didn't have the funds for packaging or transport. That night, he received a WhatsApp message. You know fit succeed for Niger unless you play the game. Settle. Everyone day do am. Tun stared at the message. He could feel the pull. How easy it would be to just do what everyone else did. Pay someone under the table. Inflate invoices. Fake documents. Keep moving. But he remembered something. Back in London, a client once told him during a case involving corruption in Angola, Africa's problem isn't its potential. It's its acceptance of shortcuts. He made a vow that night. No shortcuts. If the business failed, let it fail with dignity. He started making calls. Honest ones. He reached out to a small group of Nigerian returnees he knew from London. Young professionals trying to make clean business work in Nigeria. They understood the terrain and were willing to help. No strings attached. They introduced him to an honest packaging supplier in Ikeja. Another friend recommended a dispatch company willing to work on deferred payment. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to fit. He also started attending low-profile meetups in Ikoyi, smaller groups, mostly made of startup founders, agro-exporters, and social entrepreneurs. There were no cameras, no influencers, just hardworking Nigerians trying to build something clean. That's where he met Ada. She ran a tech-enabled shea butter export company. She had seen his product on LinkedIn and was impressed. They talked for hours that night, about logistics, about African branding, about surviving Lagos. You know, she said as they sipped palm wine on a terrace, this city doesn't reward honesty immediately, but it does eventually. Tun smiled. Let's see if eventually comes before my rent expires. They both laughed. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, he built a network. One that didn't require bribes or corruption. He made mistakes, yes. Lost money, yes. But he was learning, growing, rooting. And though the world outside moved fast and rough, Tund held on to a deeper truth. He wasn't just selling palm oil. He was selling Africa's dignity, bottled, branded, and boldly exported. And soon, someone very unexpected would help him take that dignity to the world stage. Not because they believed in him, but because they stumbled into an elevator. It was a Wednesday evening in Lagos, the kind of humid, electric night where the city felt like it was holding its breath before a storm. Tund had just wrapped up a long meeting with a potential packaging partner on Victoria Island. His energy was low, his shirt clung to his back, and his inbox was flooded with questions he didn't have answers for. He entered the lobby of a five-star hotel where he had a few hours to kill before meeting an investor flying in from Johannesburg. The plan was simple. Grab a coffee, sit in the lounge, and draft responses to his piling European inquiries. Nothing more. He pressed the elevator button, stepped in, and leaned back against the mirrored wall. Just as the doors were closing, a slender hand shot through the gap. A woman stepped in, mid-30s, tall, blonde, sharp eyes behind silver-framed glasses. She wore a simple black dress with a press badge hanging from her neck. She glanced at him and nodded politely. Evening, she said with a French accent. Evening, Tund replied. They rode in silence. Then the elevator jolted slightly before continuing. The woman muttered something in French. Tund smiled. Don't worry. That's just Lagos reminding us who's in charge. She laughed. You're not wrong. She glanced down at his briefcase, noting the gold-embossed Red Roots global logo. Red Roots? I've heard of that somewhere. You're into food exports? Tund raised a brow. Yes. Palm oil. Her eyes lit up. Wait, the palm oil company with the luxury branding? Someone mentioned you at a food expo in Brussels last month. Said your product was like Chanel for kitchens. Tun chuckled. That's generous. I wouldn't go that far. They introduced themselves. Her name was Nadine Leclerc, a senior food and trade journalist from Belgium. She was in Lagos doing a feature on African food entrepreneurs. Most of her schedule was packed with interviews at elite restaurants and cocktail tastings at places like Knock and Shiro. But now her interest shifted. Can I see the product? She asked. Tund opened his briefcase and handed her a sample bottle. The gold-trimmed cap, the elegant label, the deep red oil inside. It caught the light perfectly. Nadine held it up, reading every word. This is beautiful. I've never seen palm oil treated with this level of sophistication. I wanted to change the narrative, Tund said. People see palm oil as poor man's oil. Dirty, unrefined. But it's heritage. It's culture. And it's business, if we respect it. She looked at him seriously. Do you mind if I interview you? He blinked. When? Now? Upstairs. Just 20 minutes. That 20-minute interview turned into an hour. Nadine asked sharp, thoughtful questions about his transition from law to agriculture, about the challenges of doing clean business in a corrupted system, about the dignity of African exports. Tund answered with candor. The next morning, her article went live. The Man Who Bottled Africa's Red Gold. How a London lawyer is changing global trade from a Nigerian village. It exploded online. Within hours, Tund's email crashed. Buyers, investors, distributors, even documentary producers were reaching out. His social media followers tripled. Business pages reposted the article. Young Africans in the diaspora tagged him, calling him an inspiration. CNN Africa called. So did Al Jazeera. Suddenly, Tund wasn't just a businessman. He was a symbol. In Umanique, the village elders gathered in disbelief as foreign journalists arrived, asking for interviews, photos, footage of the mill. Even Ibuka, now strangely quiet, brought drinks to Tund's compound one night and muttered, "Oh boy, you try." But Tund wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because with fame came the next wave of challenges. The government agencies, the fake investors, the media pressure, and the quiet, creeping presence of people who saw his rise not as inspiration, but as a threat. Still, he knew one thing for sure. The elevator that night didn't just open its doors for Nadine. It opened a chapter, and he was ready to climb every floor. Tund sat at the long glass conference table in a private meeting room on the 20th floor of a high-rise in Ikoyi. Across from him sat a man in a navy blue agbada, flanked by two assistants dressed like tech founders. The table had more bottled water and fruit than necessary, but no one was eating. Everyone was waiting for him to speak. So, the man said, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against his notepad, "You want local investors to buy into palm oil? My brother, this is Nigeria, not Whole Foods." Tund smiled politely. He had heard worse. "I'm not asking for a charity donation," he replied. "I'm offering equity in a brand that's already exporting to Europe, a product that's proven itself. I just need partners who see long-term value." The man leaned back, unimpressed. "Palm oil is messy. Logistics are a nightmare. Labor is unreliable. One fire and you're finished. Why not pivot to agri-tech? Everyone wants digital." "I'm not interested in running after trends," Tund said calmly. "I'm interested in building foundations." The man gave a dismissive chuckle and waved his assistant over. "We'll think about it. But honestly, you do better with a proper godfather behind you." Tund left the room an hour later with zero commitments. That was the fourth pitch meeting that week. The article from Nadine had given him exposure, yes, but it also attracted a strange cocktail of people: opportunists, clout chasers, pseudo-investors offering visibility instead of funding. And now, with every email and DM, it became clearer that success had opened a new door, one that led straight into the politics of power. But something else was happening. After the article, younger Nigerians began reaching out. Designers, developers, agronomists, even ex-bankers who had left Lagos to start farms in Ogun, Kaduna, and Anambra. They were tired of the grind, tired of building for systems that never respected them. They wanted to build for themselves. Many of them wanted to work with him. One morning, he received a message from a 24-year-old agricultural engineer from Benin City. "I can build palm oil harvest drones. I just need someone to take a chance. Another message. I worked with a food scientist in Cape Town. I know how to extend shelf life without chemicals. Can I intern? Tund was overwhelmed, but inspired. So he started hosting Saturday gatherings at a small co-working space in Lekki. Nothing fancy. No suits. Just open laptops, honest ideas, and groundnuts in plastic bowls. They called themselves the Root Circle. A mix of youth, returnees, and dreamers, all trying to take Africa's most misunderstood industries and make them world-class. Redroots Global became more than a brand. It became a movement. But movements attract attention, and attention brings consequences. Tund began receiving friendly visits. A representative from a major Nigerian palm oil conglomerate invited him to a closed-door lunch. The man never introduced himself by name. Just a friend of the system. You're doing something good, he began. But too fast. Too loud. Tund sipped water slowly. I don't understand. The man leaned forward. You're making it look too easy. International buyers are calling you directly. That's not how this industry works. There are channels. People who expect a piece. Tund kept his face still. And if I say no? The man smiled tightly. Then you may find your trucks delayed. Your warehouses reviewed. Your clean brand suddenly accused of something unclean. When the lunch ended, Tund walked back to his car in silence. He sat in the front seat and stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His heart pounded. Not in fear, but in focus. They had noticed him, which meant he was close. That night, he met with Lanra and Ada at the mill in Imo State. Over plates of suya and cold drinks, they talked strategy. They knew they couldn't fight old systems with anger or noise. They needed scale, legitimacy, visibility that couldn't be erased. So Tund made a decision. If the system was too dirty here, he'd take the battle outside. He started preparing to go back to Europe, not as a lawyer, not as a product, but as a brand the world couldn't ignore. A European supermarket chain had just emailed. They wanted to fly him to Geneva, business class, to discuss an exclusive distribution contract for 300 stores. The jet was waiting, and the suits who once ignored his emails were suddenly clearing their calendars. The business class cabin of the jet smelled of leather and citrus. Tund sat near the window, his seat reclined slightly, laptop open. But he wasn't working. He was remembering. Years ago, in this very sky, he had flown back to Nigeria in economy class with nothing but his savings and an idea everyone mocked. Now, he was sipping espresso above the clouds, headed for a boardroom in Geneva to pitch his village business to European decision-makers. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the jet touched down at Geneva Airport, he adjusted his navy blue kaftan and stepped into the terminal with quiet confidence. A driver with a placard reading Mr. Okizi, Redroots, greeted him and whisked him into a black BMW sedan. The city passed by in a blur of glass buildings and green spaces. It was clean, quiet, calculated, everything Lagos wasn't. But as Tund stared out the window, he realized something else. It was also soulless. The heart of his business still beat in the red soil of Imo. He was simply here to make the world respect that soil. The next morning, he entered the conference room of the headquarters of Valmark, one of Europe's largest premium grocery chains. It was everything you'd expect. Polished wood panels, chilled water, expensive silence. A team of executives filed in. Suits, tablets, stiff nods. Madame Lacroix, the same woman who had placed the first small order weeks ago, walked in last. She gave Tund a brief smile, but said nothing. The head of procurement, a broad-chested man with white hair and a Rolex, began without pleasantries. Mr. Okizi, your product is interesting. It has done well in our pilot phase. We are prepared to offer you a regional contract for 300 stores in Western Europe. But, Tund leaned forward slightly. The man continued, we want exclusivity. No other supplier in Europe for 3 years. And we want you to move your packaging operations to Belgium. It's cleaner, more controlled. Tund let the silence stretch. Then he said, no. The executives blinked. I'll agree to the volume. I'll consider an exclusive distribution clause for 1 year, but not 3. And I will not move my operations out of Nigeria. The room went cold. You understand the risks? The man asked. I understand the cost of erasing where I come from, Tund replied. Redroots isn't just a product. It's a story, a statement. And if I shift everything to Europe, I'm telling the world that Africa can't produce excellence on its own soil. Madame Lacroix broke the silence. He's right. That story is the brand. The men huddled for a moment. 10 minutes later, they returned with a revised draft. 1-year exclusivity. Partial fulfillment from Nigeria allowed. 3-month rolling performance review. It was a win. But it came with a deeper lesson. You only get to set the terms when you know your worth. Later that night, Tund was invited to a gala hosted by the Valmark board. The room was filled with polished people and gloved waiters. He wore a modern agbada, black with silver trim. Heads turned. A woman whispered, "He's the palm oil guy, right?" He overheard another guest say, "He came from some village, and now he's schooling our supply chain." But Tund wasn't here to gloat. He was here to map the next frontier. The following week, he returned to Nigeria. His entire village met him at the airport. Kids waved printed photos of the Red Roots bottle. Even Chief Nonso hugged him, muttering, "You really did it, boy. You really did." But the world wouldn't let him rest. A month later, his TED Talk in London was confirmed. The venue? His former law school. The theme? Legacy through the soil. As he stepped into the hall filled with familiar faces, old professors, former colleagues, even Rachel, the friend who once laughed at his resignation, he felt no bitterness. He stood on stage and began. "I used to think the only way to change the world was through courtrooms and contracts. Now I know. It's also in fire pits and palm kernels. I didn't leave law to farm. I left law to lead." Applause thundered through the hall. But behind the noise, Tund's mind was already spinning. Something was wrong. A multinational palm oil company had just entered Nigeria with a quiet plan to undercut his pricing. Rumors swirled that they were offering bribes to his own kernel suppliers. They were coming for him. And they weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to buy him, or bury him. But what they didn't know was that Tund wasn't just one man. He was now an industry, and he had no plans to sell out. The rain in Lagos fell hard that night, pounding against the metal roof of Tund's Victoria Island apartment like a warning. He stood at his balcony, watching headlights cut through the misty downpour on Amadou Bello Way. The email was still open on his phone, the one from a multinational palm oil giant known as Goliath AgroCorp. It was short, almost arrogant. Subject: Acquisition Proposal, Confidential. "We admire your work in the palm oil sector and believe Red Roots Global would be better positioned under our portfolio. Let's discuss a full acquisition at $14 million US. Offer valid for 10 days. $14 million. That was more money than most saw in a lifetime. And yet, Tund didn't even consider it. He closed the email, slid the phone on the table, and walked into the living room where Lanra, Ada, and 2 other trusted team members were gathered. They were poring over files, export maps, supply chain issues, faces tight with concern. "They're not playing fair," Lanra said. "They've already reached out to our kernel suppliers in Bayelsa and Cross River, offering 40% above market rate to buy us out of stock. They also poached 2 of our transport vendors," Ada added. "Same ones who delivered for us last quarter. They're replacing our entire supply chain piece by piece." Tund nodded. "I know their playbook. They can't compete with our story, so they'll weaken our foundation. If I sell, we vanish. If I resist, they try to crush us slowly." He walked over to the wall where a large map of Africa hung. Red pins marked his supplier communities. Blue pins marked processing facilities. Green pins were future targets, expansion zones. Untouched land. "We're not going to fight them alone," he said, eyes fixed on the map. "We're going to unite every serious African agro-exporter who's tired of being swallowed." Silence filled the room. Ada sat up. "You're talking alliances?" "More than that. A cooperative. Pan-African. Transparent. Joint logistics. Shared warehousing. Bulk contracts negotiated as a single body." Lanra whistled. "That's big." Tund smiled. "So is the problem." Over the next month, Tund traveled. He met with a cassava flour exporter in Benin Republic, a cocoa syndicate leader in Ghana, a shea butter collective in northern Nigeria, a hibiscus farmer in Sudan with clients in Dubai. All of them had the same story. Western buyers offered crumbs, multinationals squeezed them, and no one had the infrastructure to fight back. Until now. With the help of his growing influence and Nadine's continued support in European media, Tund launched the Red Continent Cooperative, a platform that allowed African agro-entrepreneurs to share export routes, quality control resources, funding information, and buyer contacts. It wasn't a union. It was a movement. And just as it gained traction, Goliath AgroCorp escalated. They dropped their prices in Europe well below market rate. They called Red Roots a local boutique brand with inconsistent supply. Anonymous news articles started popping up questioning the safety of unregulated African exports. Then came the final blow. One morning, Tund opened his laptop to find that Goliath had copied his packaging. Gold trim, slender bottle, even the name, Pure Root. Lanra stormed into the office an hour later, fuming. This is war. Tund was calm. Let them play dirty. We stay clean, but smart. He hired an international trademark lawyer from London, sued Goliath for copyright infringement in a European court. Meanwhile, he pushed Redroot's story harder, behind-the-scenes farm footage, testimonials from Nigerian communities, a campaign called From Africa with Integrity. The public loved it. Even more importantly, buyers started asking questions. Why does Goliath's Pure Root look identical to Redroot's? Goliath refused to answer. The silence hurt them. A month later, a French judge ruled in favor of Redroot's Global. Goliath was fined, forced to recall thousands of bottles, and their credibility plummeted. But the war wasn't over. Because as soon as one enemy stepped back, another one stepped forward, from within Tund's own bloodline. A legal letter arrived from Abuja. Tund's cousin, Ibuka, had filed a lawsuit claiming ownership of the land on which the first Red Roots mill stood. He demanded 35% of all past profits and a halt to operations. Lanra stared at the papers, jaw clenched. This idiot doesn't even understand what he's doing. Oh, he does, Tund replied. He wants a piece. Now that we've built something real. The court date was set. And this time, Tund wouldn't just be defending his business. He'd be defending his entire legacy on live national television. But what the world didn't know was that he had a secret. One that could turn the case upside down. One that even Ibuka had forgotten. And Tund planned to reveal it at the perfect moment. The courtroom in Abuja was nothing like the ones Tund had practiced in during his days as a solicitor in London. It had the same formality, yes, the same echoes of power in the wood-paneled walls and the worn carpet. But the tension here felt heavier, more personal. On one side sat Ibuka, his cousin, dressed in a three-piece suit too tight for his frame, trying to look confident. Behind him, a team of lawyers whispered, scribbled, and shuffled papers. They had come armed with documents that claimed the family land on which Tund built the first Red Roots mill had been illegally seized. Ibuka wanted blood. Or, more accurately, cash. On the other side of the courtroom, Tund sat straight-backed in a custom navy blue kaftan, his legal counsel beside him, an experienced property rights expert from Lagos. Lanra and Ada sat behind him, silent but alert. The public gallery was full. Journalists, influencers, farmers, students. Everyone knew this wasn't just a land dispute. It was a fight for the soul of Red Roots. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. As proceedings began, Ibuka's lawyers stood to present. He spoke of tradition, family land, betrayal. He painted Tund as a runaway son who had returned from the West only to exploit his ancestors' land for personal profit, ignoring family heritage and excluding blood relatives from wealth they were entitled to. Tund watched silently, jaw tight. He didn't move. He didn't blink. When it was time for his team to respond, his lawyer began calmly. Your Lordship, our client is not denying family ties. He's not even denying the importance of heritage. But this case is not about sentiment. It is about law. He handed a bundle of documents to the judge and the opposing counsel. Deed of gift. Signed and notarized. 8 years ago. From Tund's late grandfather, Chief Nnamdi Okizi, to Tund Okizi. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ibuka's lawyer stood again, visibly rattled. That signature. How do we know it wasn't forged? Tund's lawyer smiled. We anticipated that question. Your Lordship, we have the original notary officer present in court, and handwriting analysis confirmed by the Federal Registry. Additionally, he paused. Tund stood up and addressed the court directly. Your Honor, if I may. The judge nodded. Tund walked slowly to the front of the court. Then he pulled out a small, worn leather notebook and placed it on the table. This is my grandfather's journal, he said. Every Sunday for 2 years, we sat under the mango tree in his compound. We talked about this land, about what it could become. One day, he looked at me and said, your brothers will build houses. You will build history. He flipped the notebook open. There, written in the shaky but clear script of Chief Nnamdi, were his words. To my grandson Tund, I give this land, not for profit, but for purpose. Build wisely. The courtroom fell into silence. Ibuka slumped slightly in his chair. The judge nodded and turned to both parties. I believe we've seen enough. 2 weeks later, the ruling came. The court dismissed the case entirely, affirming the deed of gift as legally binding. Ibuka's claim was declared without merit, and he was ordered to pay court costs. Redroots was safe, but the headlines weren't about the ruling. They were about the moment. Palm Oil King defends legacy with grandfather's words. Tund Okizi wins court battle without raising his voice. From soil to courtroom, the African exporter changing narratives. Back in Lagos, Tund returned to the Redroots headquarters to find his entire staff waiting outside. They clapped and sang as he stepped out of the car. A marching band had even been hired. Someone released red and gold balloons into the sky. Ada walked up to him, laughing. You should lose more cases. This kind of party is rare. Lanra raised a glass of palm wine. To soil and soul. Tund smiled, but his mind was already racing ahead. Because while the world was celebrating his legal victory, something else was brewing. A confidential email had just come in from a top executive at the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA. They were launching a regional export accelerator, and they wanted Redroots to spearhead the palm oil sector across all 54 African nations. But that also meant dealing with politics, with presidents, with diplomats, with egos. Tund looked up at the balloons fading into the dusky Lagos sky. He had won the village. Now he had to win the continent. But what he didn't know was that his biggest challenge wasn't a lawsuit, a competitor, or even a government. It was something more delicate, more dangerous. And it was sitting in a Paris boardroom, planning to buy the Redroots name behind his back, with someone on his own team feeding them information. It was 2:47 a.m. in Lagos when Tund's phone buzzed. He was in his study, surrounded by architectural renderings of a new Redroots processing facility he planned to build in Abidjan. His eyes were red. His coffee was cold. He picked up. Boss, it's Lanra, came the voice on the other end. I need to show you something. Now, check your inbox. Tund opened his laptop and clicked into his encrypted email. The message was short. Subject, urgent, internal leak. Boss, someone on our executive team has been communicating with a French investment group. They've submitted confidential documents about Redroots to a company called Elantera. Tund froze. Elantera was no ordinary investor. They were a sleek, aggressive European food conglomerate known for swallowing up promising African brands and replacing them with sterile, Europe-controlled versions. On the surface, they claimed to support local entrepreneurship. In reality, they centralized power. And now, someone from inside Redroots was trying to sell them his empire. He scrolled further down Lanra's email and saw a series of screenshots, meeting notes, profit margins, proprietary processing methods, all forwarded to a private Elantera address. The signature on the last document sent chills down his spine. Ada. Tund leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The walls of the study felt like they were closing in. He had trusted Ada like a sister. She had been there since the early days, when they couldn't even afford real accounting software. She'd slept on the same office couch, celebrated every small victory, held him up when shipments were delayed or when banks refused funding. Why? Lanra's voice cut in again. You need to decide what to do before she buries us. I can confront her, but... No, Tund said, standing slowly. I will. That afternoon, he invited Ada to lunch at a private lounge in Ikoyi, overlooking the Lagos Lagoon. The setting was quiet, serene, too peaceful for what he had planned. Ada arrived in a fitted blue dress and heels, smiling like nothing was wrong. Trying to impress a buyer? Tund asked, pouring her water without waiting for an answer. She blinked. What? You sent our trade secrets to Elantera. I know. Her smile faltered, then vanished. She looked away for a long moment. I didn't want to do it. They approached me after the TED Talk went viral. Said Redroots was too big to stay in your hands. That they could globalize it, properly. I was supposed to bring you to the table. Quietly. Tund's jaw clenched. And the backdoor data leaks. Ada's voice softened. I thought, if you saw their offer, if you saw the scale of what they could do with the brand, you'd understand. You'd finally stop this from the village crusade. You're too emotional about this, Tund. He stared at her like she was a stranger. You think building with integrity is emotional? No. she said, meeting his eyes. But sometimes, legacy needs to make room for power. Tun stood. Power without roots will always collapse. You've made your choice. I'll make mine. He walked out without another word. That evening, an emergency board meeting was held. Ada was removed from her executive post. A new cybersecurity protocol was introduced. Every future investor would go through a 6-month scrutiny window. Tund also began working with an internal loyalty team, carefully restructuring departments so that no single person ever had full access again. But the betrayal had rattled him, not because Ada tried to sell him out, but because she believed Redroots needed to be saved from him. 2 weeks later, he flew to Accra for the AFCFTA Accelerator Conference. The event was lavish, held at the Movenpick, filled with ministers, diplomats, young African entrepreneurs in velvet jackets and smart sneakers. Tun stood on stage, looking down at a crowd eager to hear from the man who turned red oil into red gold. But he didn't give them the polished story they expected. He gave them the truth. We think our enemies are abroad, he said. But sometimes they sit beside us in our offices. Sometimes they share our champagne, even our vision, until they see a shortcut. He paused. My advice to you: build something so grounded, no one can hijack it. Build with your people, not just those who clap when you rise, but those who won't sell you when you sleep. The hall erupted in applause. But behind the clapping, a few serious faces whispered. Deals were being considered. Partnerships questioned. Eyes opened. That night, back in his hotel suite, Tund received another email. This one had no sender name, just a subject line. You stopped Elantera, but there are others. Watch your border deals in East Africa. And a single attachment, a scanned letter of intent between a mysterious Rwandan export conglomerate and a Kenyan processing plant, offering to rebrand palm oil entirely under a new name. One disturbingly close to Redroot's visual identity. Tund shut his laptop and looked out at the Accra skyline. He had protected his village. Now he was protecting a continent. But what he didn't know was that, across the ocean, in a quiet office in Manhattan, another deal was brewing. Wall Street had just discovered Redroots. And this time, they weren't coming for oil. They were coming for control. It was barely dawn in Lagos when Tund's private line rang, this time from New York. The voice on the other end was sharp, confident, American. Mr. Okezie, I'm Dean Carter, Managing Director at Goldstone Capital. We manage agricultural portfolios worth over $9 billion globally. We've been watching Redroots for some time now, and we'd like to talk. Tund was already on edge from the message in Accra. Now Wall Street was calling? He responded cautiously. I'm listening. Dean continued, we don't just want to buy in. We want to scale you beyond anything the continent's ever seen. Infrastructure, R&D, smart logistics, real money. We're talking IPO-level growth. We have the means to turn Redroots into Africa's first global agri-unicorn. Tund paced slowly around his living room, phone pressed to his ear. And what would you need from me? He asked. Just access. Full operational visibility. Board seats. Of course, you'd remain CEO, on paper. But we'd guide strategy. Expansion. Messaging. Tund smiled coldly. In other words, you want my face, but not my voice. There was a pause on the other end. I'm saying you've built something powerful, but it's still regional. You need structure, global corporate governance, legal shields, and above all, investor confidence. We provide that. Send the paperwork, Tund said. Then he hung up, not because he was going to sign, but because he wanted to see how deep this rabbit hole went. Later that day, Lonra and 2 legal analysts sat with him reviewing the proposal. It was slick, calculated. Hidden within the jargon were clauses that would eventually override Tund's decisions. His image would remain, but the soul of Redroots, the community-driven, continent-first vision, would die slowly. They're smart, Lonra muttered, scanning a clause titled Operational Realignment Protocols. They've done this before, Tund replied. And indeed, they had. A deep dive into Goldstone's portfolio revealed a trail of former African brands now stripped of cultural identity, repackaged with sterile Western branding, and operated by overseas management. What had once been grassroots businesses were now just export logos. But this wasn't the worst part. Buried in a separate financial disclosure file was a familiar name, Elantera. Goldstone and Elantera were strategic partners. Ada's betrayal hadn't just been a side story. It had been the opening chapter. Furious but composed, Tund took a flight to Nairobi the next morning. It wasn't about running. It was about gathering allies. If they were coming for red roots from Europe and America, he needed the continent behind him. At a rooftop dinner with a coalition of East African agricultural founders, he laid it out bare. They're not afraid of our product, he said, raising a glass of palm wine. They're afraid of our independence, that we can process, package, brand, and export without them. He went on. Red Roots is just the beginning. What we build together, across Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Rwanda, Senegal, is bigger. This is about owning our food systems, our trade, our identity. We don't need saving. We need each other. That night, 7 companies signed a memorandum of mutual protection and resource sharing. It was unofficial, but it was powerful. Back in Lagos, as Tund returned to headquarters, he found a strange package waiting on his desk. No label, no return address. Inside, a black flash drive, a printed photo of him shaking hands with the Minister of Trade at the AFCFTA summit, and a single note. They'll use this against you. Be ready. Tund immediately called his IT security chief. The flash drive contained a manipulated audio file, deepfake technology, of Tund allegedly discussing bribery with a government official. Whoever sent it had access to top-tier software. It was enough to damage his reputation unless he acted first. And so, the next day, he did the unthinkable. He went live on Red Root's social media channels. Dressed in a simple agbada, seated behind his desk, he looked straight into the camera. My name is Tundo Kizi, founder of Red Roots. And I want to talk to you, not through lawyers, not through PR firms, but as one African to another. He explained the smear campaign. He exposed the connection between Goldstone, Elantera, and the synthetic scandal. He even played a portion of the deep-fake audio and then showed a side-by-side of the original conversation. Technology can fake our voice, he said, but it cannot fake our intent. The video went viral. Within 48 hours, over 2.5 million people had shared it. News outlets picked it up across Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, even the diaspora in London and New York. Hashtag #StandWithRedRoots trended for a week. Meanwhile, quietly, Goldstone pulled out. Public pressure was too high, the risk too visible. They denied involvement, but the damage to their reputation in Africa was done. Red Roots survived again. But Tund wasn't resting. Because just days later, a whisper started in global financial circles. A new player was emerging. A stealth investment group backed by Asian oil giants was looking to enter West Africa's palm oil space. They didn't want a partner. They wanted to dominate. And they had already made their first move. They bought the entire port access in Calabar, Tund's main export route. And just like that, Red Roots was cut off. But Tund had a plan. And this time, he wouldn't play defense. He would build something no one could block, buy, or bury. And the world wasn't ready for it. The Calabar blockade was more than an inconvenience. It was a message. The Asian syndicate didn't need to threaten Tund with lawsuits or smear campaigns. All they had to do was control the ports, and Red Roots would slowly bleed out. For the first time in years, shipments of Red Roots palm oil sat idle. Containers that were supposed to reach buyers in Dubai, Singapore, and Berlin were grounded. Emails from distributors piled up. Prices dropped. Whispers of Red Roots being too risky began to surface in international trade rooms. Lanra stormed into Tund's office 3 days after the closure. They've got Calabar locked for 5 years, Tund. 5. That's longer than most product cycles in this business. We can't wait that out. Tund was quiet. He wasn't shocked. He expected this. Then we won't, he said. Let them have Calabar. It was never truly ours anyway. Lanra blinked. Then what's the move? Tund walked over to the large regional map on the wall. His fingers traced a bold new route. We go inland. It was unorthodox. Risky. But Tund had already been speaking to a logistics firm in Rwanda that specialized in inland African freight. If they couldn't go out through the ports, they would build a new transcontinental corridor, one that moved Red Roots palm oil across Africa itself, from Nigeria through Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Uganda, and finally into Kenya, where Mombasa's port was still independent. It was a logistical nightmare, and it would be the boldest trade move any African agribusiness had ever attempted. Within a week, Tund flew to Nairobi, this time not for a summit, but for boots-on-ground deals. He met with East Africa's top transport moguls, He secured refrigerated container trucks, cross-border insurance protections, and diplomatic approvals in record time. Still, he needed a backbone, a supply chain ecosystem Red Roots could control fully, without gatekeepers. That's when the idea struck. A Pan-African agri-union. Not a union of workers, but of producers, processors, and exporters. An alliance of businesses that didn't just move products, but owned the full path from farm to foreign shelf. And he knew just the person to help him do it. He reached out to Mariam Diallo, a powerful agri-economist from Senegal known for organizing regional co-ops. She had once turned an abandoned cashew project into West Africa's biggest dry nut syndicate. Over coffee in a private Dakar lounge, she leaned forward. "You're not just fighting for Red Roots," she said. "You're fighting to break the global food chain's leash on Africa." Tun nodded. "Exactly. I don't want to be another success story. I want to be the last first, the one who made it possible for the next 100. Together, they began drafting the blueprint for the Pan-African Agri-Union, or PAU. It would operate under a simple principle. No African product should leave the continent without value added. Palm oil wouldn't be shipped raw. It would be processed, packaged, and branded on African soil, employing African talent, using African materials, and flowing through African-controlled infrastructure. The idea gained momentum. Founders from Tanzania, Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and even Ethiopia joined. Countries often divided by language and politics were now connected by shared risk and shared vision. But as the PAU model began to gain press attention, trouble returned. This time, not from the West, but from within. A coalition of African political elites, quietly benefiting from old port deals and foreign trade kickbacks, began resisting the movement. They accused Tund of trying to create a private government, of overstepping his role as an entrepreneur. A summit in Addis Ababa was abruptly canceled. Banking licenses in Malawi were frozen. And most dangerously, a fake scandal was launched alleging that Red Roots had caused environmental damage in the Niger Delta. Photos of unrelated oil spills were circulated. Activists paid. Hashtags bought. Tun knew what this was. Not sabotage. Fear. They were afraid of what Red Roots and the Agri-Union represented. That an African business could rise without bowing. But Tun didn't retreat. He doubled down. He appeared on every major news outlet, CNN Africa, Al Jazeera, even CNBC, and spoke openly. He admitted challenges, shared setbacks, and then revealed the union's 10-year plan. A cross-border trade route bypassing neo-colonial ports. An open ledger system to track profits and ensure farmers got their dues. And eventually, a continental agricultural stock exchange. Investors began to look again, but not from the usual places. The African diaspora stepped in, Nigerians in Atlanta, Kenyans in Toronto, Senegalese in Paris. They created crowdfunding hubs. They hosted dinners. They spoke on podcasts. Suddenly, Red Roots wasn't just a company. It was a movement. And then came the call that changed everything. It was from the president of Ghana. He wanted to host the first official headquarters of the Pan-African Agri-Union in Accra. He offered tax-free status, land, and full diplomatic protections. When Tund arrived in Accra for the inauguration ceremony, he was welcomed with drums, dancers, and security escorts. But just as he was about to step into the ceremony hall, Lonra rushed up to him, face pale. He held out a printed email. Tund read it once, then twice. It was from the United Nations Trade Council. Your organization has triggered a security review. Concerns have been raised about anti-competitive alliances, regional destabilization, and unregulated private power structures. Please prepare to present Red Roots and the Agri-Union for formal review by the international body. In other words, the world had started watching, not to support, but to contain. And in the quiet corner of that Ghanaian palace, Tund finally realized. The war was no longer about palm oil. It was about who controls Africa's future. And he had just become the most visible threat to the old system.